Telecommunications is one of the fastest growing sectors in the South African economy, driven by rapid growth in mobile telephony and broadband connectivity. Telco companies are rolling out various innovative projects. What does 2012 have in store for the telco industry and those operating within it? Joining me now to share their views, Angus Hay, the CTO of Neotel, Mayan Mathen, the CTO of Middle East and Africa region at Dimension Data, Stefano Mattiello, Channel Director at Cisco South Africa, and Jacques, the MD of Vox Orion. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so very much for joining us. So we're looking at trends in 2011. We're looking at what's in store for 2012. A lot of disappointments last year because we had a lot of promises that had been put on the table and unfortunately some of them not being met. Angus, let's start off with you.
Okay. In terms of the 2011, I think despite some of the lack of some of the changes we were expecting on the regulatory side, we did see good growth in the industry. What was not so great about 2011 is local loop unbundling didn't happen. And I think
there was a deadline for November for that.
Yes, and there was in fact an ECOSA announcement in November, but which hasn't really created any immediate local loop unbundling. And perhaps this year we'll see that start to happen. And the second thing I think is there's still a lot of pressure to get more spectrum, particularly as we move out of 3G into the next generation of technologies. The mobile players and a number of other players are still waiting for spectrum to happen to make that happen.
Mayan, let's look at local loop unbundling and the auctioning off of the spectrum. Those are the two main points that we looked at last year. We also saw a lot of changes to the Ministry of Communications in South Africa. Is it very disappointing from a private sector perspective to have seen these two important items being put to the wayside once again?
I think key, Eleni, is the fact that the changes in the structures in the government and leadership has led to a further delay in activity, and that does not help any of the telecommunications and ICT industry in meeting the demand that we're seeing from the businesses, the enterprises and the consumers. And that delay in monetizing the opportunity with unleashing more spectrum and capability in access networks is definitely going to have an impact longer term.
Stefano, I mean, looking at the overall growth in the industry, fastest growing, as I mentioned in the introduction, but we are starting to see policy issues affecting the potential growth that we see in South Africa. Would you say that this has been one of the biggest failures in 2011?
Very difficult to comment whether that's been a failure or not, whether that's had an impact. Certainly what we've seen is that the market is starting to position itself into the next wave of the internet. It's definitely happening on a global scale, and we're starting to see some of that deployment happening within the local environment. I think the biggest challenge we face in South Africa is getting true broadband access to as many people as quickly as possible. And if anything, from a policy perspective, I think that's the one area that needs to be addressed, because the internet is exploding at one heck of a rate, and it's our ability to actually connect to that quickly and effectively and as many people as we can get to.
But do you think that LLU is the actual solution to the problem that you're stating?
I'm not too sure if LLU in isolation is the actual solution, because what we're starting to see is a shift very quickly into a mobile connected environment. Okay, so I think yes, definitely there's a role to play for LLU, but there's also a role for the wireless and mobile access, which also needs to be speeded up and to be made a lot more affordable.
Jacques, I know you have a very different view when it comes to local loop unbundling, because you are of the view that it's not going to actually have the perceived effect or value. Yeah.
And I think we're creating the perception amongst the consumers that local loop unbundling will drive the costs down. It will create more competition in the market. The reality for me is local loop unbundling is only one portion of the bigger scheme of things. Until we've defined the rule sets, who maintains it, how do we interconnect, how do we charge it, local loop unbundling is meaningless at the end of the day. It's an old technology if it's limited to Telkom's copper network. So why would we want to deploy services on old technology?
Are you saying that we actually need to roll out fibre, that there is no way about it?
Well, in my belief, is because I should say local loop unbundling is getting access to every term of access every type of access technology that Telkom is rolling.
I mean, ironically, that the positive spin-off of not having local loop unbundling is that everyone's rolling out fibre networks. So I think the incentive to roll out fibre disappears in markets where you have local loop unbundling. So a number of European markets, the fibre rollout of access has been very slow. Whereas in countries where there hasn't been local loop unbundling, there has been more fibre rollout. But at the end of the day, we need a mix of ways to get broadband. Because the problem with South Africa is we don't have anywhere near enough broadband. We have about 2% broadband penetration. and we need to get that up to 10, 20, 30.
And Angus, the truth is, I mean, you mentioned ICASA, and this is when now ICASA is starting to do a lot of the research and saying, okay, how viable is it, and how are we going to actually roll out this new project, local loop unbundling? So this is going to be a key theme going into 2012. Are we going to see solutions found this year on the matter?
Look, I think, I mean, maybe not to be specific about local loop, but I think just to talk about ICASA and in line with the, when we're talking about a new team and the new minister, I think the key thing to bear in mind is that the industry is a playing field. The industry is a playing field today with, in telecoms alone, we probably got 300 players of various kinds. If you include the ICT market, it's many thousands of players. And the role of policymakers and regulators is to keep that playing field level and ensure that everybody has a chance to kick the ball. It's not to kick the ball. And I think that's the key that we need to bear in mind, is that the regulators are facilitator. They need to move fast, they need to move effectively, and they need to ensure that everyone has a shot. It's not about trying to get a perfect long-term solution. That's not the role of a regulator.
Okay, so Mayan, I see you agreeing there.
I agree to an extent, and also there isn't a perfect model. If you look at the Lightspeed model in the US with the spectrum for LTE, there's a constant fight. The Russian model, which is what ICASA is referring to as a benchmark for themselves, I don't think anyone's got the answer yet. And I think the more pressure that we are exerting towards a policymaker, the pressure will expedite some progress. But I don't think we're going to find a utopia pretty soon.
Just like to add there, I mean, we're talking about LTE now. If it's too costly to acquire that license, ultimately the consumer will bear the cost of that acquisition.
You're talking long-term evolution
now. I think LTE in itself allows us to deploy a whole lot, a set of new applications, technologies, video conferencing. Matt talks about the explosion of mobile video conferencing. If the network operators that end up getting that spectrum, that LTE spectrum, passes the excessive cost onto the consumer, we won't see that explosion.
There are two pilot projects underway in South Africa. It's Vodacom and MTN. Is it likely that they would then get the spectrum because they're currently piloting the project and they've got proof that it works?
I wouldn't say so. If ICASA manages it properly and it's an auction process.
We're right in the middle of a process where ICASA has actually got a document out and everybody's supposed to comment on the document. And as Mayan says, there's part of that document refers to a model which is modelled after some thinking in Russia, which is to build wholesale access networks and have some independent third party running an access network for all the players. Now that's worked in some markets. It's worked in the UK on 3G. It's worked in a number of different markets where you can lower the costs by sharing the investment. Whether in fact it can be enforced rather than voluntary is a more complicated debate. So the spectrum has to get out there. Someone has to invest, and it's going to be billions and billions to invest in LTE technology particularly, and it needs to be available as soon as possible.
Stefano, get involved in this conversation. Tell us what your thoughts are. I know you're listening, and with regards to LTE, the money that needs to be spent.
I think the issue is not so much around the technology and the availability of the technology. It's been proven on a global scale. It's there, it's happening, other countries are doing it. I think the sense of urgency needs to be created in South Africa to make sure that it's available, and it's available quickly, at the right level, the right price points. I think that's the point that Jacques was making, is that we can no longer afford to spend or to wait a couple of years before this happens. It's moving, the pace, the rate of pace is accelerating a lot quicker. So we need to be able to respond. Now, whether that's the regulator's job or whether that's a service provider's job, I'm not here to comment. But certainly, what we're seeing is that the internet is coming not to us at a tidal wave level. It's coming to us at a kind of as a tsunami, right? And we need to be in a position to be able to get on board and go with it.
Who's to blame here? I mean, given the fact that the Ministry of Communications has had 3 ministers in 3 years, lots of changes happening at the top. Can we say that the Communications Department should be working harder at this? Do you think that it's ICASA? Do you think it's a combination of policymakers?
I think it needs to. There certainly is a political agenda, and you're starting to see a direct correlation between governments that have invested in ICT aggressively, and if you look at their capability, their GDP growth. So my personal view is that it needs to be high on government's agenda to invest in this technology and to make sure that it does get rolled out, it does become available.
I think one of the challenges that we're faced with is the interpretation of what's the correct business model to get LTE out there. The historic models of allocating spectrum has been to a single license holder. And in these new business models, the particular model that ICASA is looking at, the wholesale model, is one that we all have to come together and participate in a sharing model. And that investment's not going to come from a single party potentially. Or if a single party is going to invest, is finding a way to find a channel through the other operators that want to take service to market. And I think that's the challenge that we have to deal with.
I think it's important, and here one can pick up some differences in thinking and policy versus regulation. ICASA's model is actually based on some fairly solid thinking from some jurisdictions. It's not necessarily what's happened in every jurisdiction. However, if you look at the policy that drives towards having, for example, a national broadband network, there are some philosophical differences about how that can be done. So it can be done very much on the model of investment by government into infrastructure. And it can also equally well be done if you facilitate investment by private industry. To date in South Africa, our success has been the facilitation of investment by private industry. So the billions that are needed to roll out these new networks, if a model can be adopted which makes it possible for private investors to invest, make their money, and yet still deliver services, that has worked best for us. And I think that's really where it needs to be.
Jacques, from an LTE perspective, it seems that it's still very much this whole mobile revolution that we're seeing in South Africa, in fact in the whole African continent, but there is still some fibre that is connected to this. There still needs to be the rolling out of this infrastructure.
There still needs to be fibre. I think fibre is more reliable, higher speeds, more cost effective over the long term. But there's a place, or mobility is starting to play a bigger role. So there'll be the more mobile devices or smart devices that gets out into the market, the more the applications will be developed for those smart devices, and less will be the requirement for fibre.
Right, we're hitting pause there, and we're going to a very short break. And when we return, we'll be delving into some key technological advancements for 2012 and whether South Africa can keep up with the rest of the world. Don't go anywhere.